This is Thomas Carter. At just 10 years old, he owned almost nothing. No house, no parents, no address. Just a beat-up backpack, a worn pencil, and a notebook he had already filled 3 times over. He slept in a shelter on the edge of town and spent his days the way most kids spend summer vacation. Except instead of video games and swimming pools, Thomas spent his learning. Reading whatever he could find. Studying problems nobody had asked him to solve. Preparing for a future that hadn't invited him yet. He had never set foot inside a real school. But that didn't stop him from teaching himself everything one could teach. Then one afternoon, on the perfectly cut lawn of a $50 million estate, a girl in a crisp navy blazer couldn't solve a problem her expensive tutor had spent 2 weeks trying to explain. Thomas solved it in 30 seconds. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. He didn't know the girl's father was watching from the driveway. And he had no idea that one man's silence in that moment was about to change everything. 6 weeks earlier, the shelter on Granger Street woke up at 5:30 every morning. Not because of alarms, because of noise, coughing, metal cots scraping the floor, the smell of weak coffee and old shoes. 40 people in one room, each one carrying a story they didn't want to tell. Thomas Carter was the only child. He was also the first one awake. By 5:45, he was already sitting near the window with his notebook open. The light was bad. He didn't care. He had 3 pages of long division to finish before breakfast, and he wasn't going to waste the quiet. The other men in the shelter didn't know what to make of him. A 10-year-old boy, alone, bent over a notebook like he had somewhere important to be. Some of them left him alone. Some of them asked where his mother was. Thomas always gave the same answer. She's gone. He didn't explain further, and something about the way he said it made people stop asking. He had been on his own for 4 months. Before that, he had lived with his grandmother in a small apartment 2 towns over. She had been the one who taught him that a library card was free and that free things, used correctly, could take you anywhere. When she died, he lost the apartment, the books she kept on the kitchen shelf, and the only person who had ever looked at him like he mattered. What he didn't lose was the habit. Every morning, the notebook. Every afternoon, the library. Every evening, whatever odd job he could find, sweeping a shop front, carrying bags, returning carts in a parking lot, enough for a meal and a small donation to the shelter, so they'd let him keep his cot. He didn't spend what little he had on anything else. He didn't need anything else. It was on a Thursday afternoon, cutting through a side street he didn't usually take, that Thomas first saw the estate. He almost walked past it. But something near the gate caught his eye. A recycling bin, half open, and spilling out of it worksheets. Printed school papers marked in red pen, tossed out like they meant nothing. He stopped, pulled one out. Pre-algebra, grade 7. Thomas read it once, then again. His fingers moved along the margin, working through the problems the student had gotten wrong. He got every single one right. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his backpack. He came back the next day. And the day after that. He didn't know whose house it was. He didn't know the name on the gate. He just knew that whoever lived inside was throwing away things he would have given anything to own. And that felt like the saddest thing he had ever seen. Victoria Hayes had never failed anything. Not a spelling test, not a piano recital, not a single swimming time trial at her private academy's end-of-term meet. She had been raised in a house where excellence was not a goal. It was simply what was expected, the way other families expected their children to brush their teeth before bed. So when the standardized test results came back on a Wednesday morning and her score sat in the bottom third of her grade, Victoria didn't cry. She folded the paper in half, then in half again. Then she put it at the very bottom of her school bag, underneath everything else, and she didn't speak for the rest of the afternoon. Her tutor spent 2 hours that evening going over the section she had failed: ratios, proportional reasoning. He explained it 4 different ways. Victoria nodded each time. She understood the words, but something about the way the numbers connected, the logic underneath the method, kept slipping away from her, like trying to hold water in her hands. He left at 7. She still didn't understand it. She told no one. The next afternoon, instead of sitting in the study wing the way she was supposed to, Victoria slipped out through the back door and crossed the lawn to the far end of the garden. She needed air. She needed to think without someone watching her think. She sat down in the grass, spread her test paper in front of her, and stared at it. The problem that had broken her was question 14. She had read it 6 times now. It still didn't make sense, not the way it was supposed to. She didn't notice the boy at the fence. He noticed her. Thomas had come back the same way he always did, quiet, unhurried, checking the recycling bin near the gate before settling near the far post to read. But when he looked up, he saw the girl in the navy blazer sitting alone in the grass. Her brow was tight. Her pencil wasn't moving. He looked at the paper in front of her. He could see question 14 from where he was standing. He knew the answer. He didn't plan to say anything. He almost didn't. But the silence stretched too long, and something in him, the same part that couldn't walk past a discarded worksheet without stopping, wouldn't let him stay quiet. "You're setting it up wrong," he said. "The ratio goes the other way." Victoria's head snapped up. She stared at him, a boy she had never seen before, standing at her family's fence in a faded brown shirt, looking at her test paper like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Who are you?" she said. "Nobody," Thomas said. "Do you want to know how to solve it or not?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at question 14. "Show me," she said. The next afternoon, Victoria was already sitting in the grass when Thomas arrived. She didn't wave. She didn't say hello. She just held up a new worksheet and said, "I have more." He came through the gap in the fence he had noticed weeks ago, a corner post that had come loose from the ground, just wide enough. He sat down a few feet away from her, cross-legged, and looked at the paper she handed him. That was how it started. Thomas didn't teach the way her tutors did. He didn't write steps on a whiteboard or explain rules she was supposed to memorize. He just thought out loud. He'd look at a problem, say whatever came into his head, follow the logic wherever it led, and somehow, by the time he reached the answer, Victoria had followed him there too. It wasn't like being taught. It was like watching someone think, and slowly realizing she could think the same way. By the end of the first week, she had stopped dreading question 14. By the end of the second, she was finishing problems before he did. He noticed. He didn't say anything, but she caught the small nod he gave, the almost smile he aimed at the grass instead of at her, like he was proud but didn't want to make it a big deal. She started looking forward to it more than anything else in her day. She stopped telling her tutors what she was learning. When they asked why she suddenly understood ratios, she said the extra practice had helped. When they praised her for working so hard on her own, she smiled and said thank you. She didn't feel entirely good about it, but she didn't stop. She told herself it was because the sessions might end if anyone found out, that Thomas might get in trouble, that it was simpler this way. She didn't yet understand that she was protecting him. Thomas, for his part, never talked about himself, not where he slept, not what he ate, not why a boy his age was spending afternoons at a stranger's fence instead of somewhere else. Victoria wanted to ask. She almost did once. But something about the way he arrived, quiet, careful, always checking over his shoulder before he came through the gap, told her not to push. What she knew was this. For 2 hours every afternoon, sitting in the grass with a notebook between them, something happened that didn't happen anywhere else in her carefully scheduled life. She felt like herself. Not Victoria Hayes of the Hayes estate. Not the girl with the blazer and the test scores, and the father who expected excellence like it was oxygen. Just Victoria, 10 years old, learning something real. Neither of them noticed the small red light blinking steadily on the security camera mounted above the garden wall. It had been recording since the very first day. The notice went up on a Monday. A printed sheet of paper, taped to the wall near the shelter's front desk. Thomas read it once on his way to breakfast and didn't read it again. He didn't need to. The words had already settled into his chest like a stone. Facility closing. Residents must vacate within 21 days. Redevelopment. He ate his breakfast. He packed his backpack. He went to the library. He didn't tell anyone. The sessions continued, but something had shifted. Victoria noticed it the second day, the way Thomas sat down a little slower than usual, the way his eyes took longer to focus on the page in front of him. He was still sharp, still faster than anyone she had ever met, but there was a tiredness underneath it now that hadn't been there before, something heavier. She didn't ask. She had learned by now that asking Thomas direct questions about his life was like pushing on a door that had been locked from the inside. He wouldn't fight back. He would just go quiet in a way that made her feel worse than if she had said nothing at all. So she watched, and she waited. By the second week, his answers were taking a half-second longer. He lost his place once in the middle of explaining something, just stopped, blinked, found his spot again. He brushed it off. She pretended not to notice. But she noticed. It was a Thursday afternoon when she found him. She had come out 10 minutes early, the way she sometimes did. Thomas wasn't at the fence. She scanned the garden, nothing. Then she walked to the far end, where the old stone wall ran along the back of the property, half covered in ivy. He was there, sitting against the wall with his backpack in his lap and his head tipped back, completely asleep. His notebook had fallen open beside him. His pencil was still in his hand. Victoria stood very still. He looked younger when he was asleep. The focus left his face, and what remained was just a boy. A tired, small, 10-year-old boy, alone on the wrong side of a wall that wasn't his. She didn't wake him. She sat down a few feet away and waited. When he finally stirred, 20 minutes later, and opened his eyes and saw her sitting there, something moved across his face, embarrassment, then fear, then a careful blankness she recognized as the expression he used when he didn't want her to ask questions. "Thomas," she said quietly, "where did you sleep last night?" He didn't answer right away. "Somewhere," he said. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the wall behind him, the wall that separated his world from hers. She made a decision. She just didn't know yet whether it was the right one. The results arrived on a Friday morning. Jonathan Hayes was in his car when his phone buzzed, an email from Victoria's school, flagged urgent. He read it twice at a red light, then put the phone down and drove the rest of the way home in silence. Victoria's scores hadn't just improved. They had jumped 3 grade levels in comprehension, top 5% in mathematical reasoning. Her teacher had written a personal note at the bottom of the report. "We'd like to recommend Victoria for formal gifted assessment. Whatever she's been doing, keep it up." Jonathan found her at the dining table after school, still in her uniform, working through a problem set with the kind of quiet focus he usually only saw in adults. He set the report down in front of her. "Your teachers are very impressed," he said. She looked at the paper. "Good." "Victoria," he waited until she looked up. "What changed?" 1 second passed. That was all, just 1 second of hesitation before she said, "I've been working harder, focusing more." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. She held his gaze as she said it. Her voice didn't shake. But Jonathan Hayes had spent 20 years in rooms full of people telling him what he wanted to hear. He knew the difference between an answer and a performance. He didn't push. He nodded once, folded the report, and said he was proud of her. Then he went to his office and pulled up the security footage. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. A tutor she had hired privately, maybe. A study group. Some explanation that made sense. What he found was 47 minutes of his daughter, sitting in the grass, with a boy he had never seen before. He watched without moving. The boy in the worn brown shirt talked with his hands. Victoria leaned forward, nodded, grabbed the pencil, wrote. The boy shook his head, not like this, like that, and she erased it and tried again. They argued over something on page 3 of a notebook for 6 full minutes. Then Victoria laughed. Then the boy smiled at the grass. Jonathan watched all 47 minutes. Then he sat in the dark and watched it again. He recognized the notebook. The same brand, the same size, as the ones he used to carry to school as a kid. Before the money, before the companies, before this house with its cameras and its manicured lawn and its gates that kept the wrong people out. He didn't call security. He didn't wake Victoria. He just sat there in his office at 11:30 at night. The footage paused on the boy's face, and he stayed very still. Like a man who had just seen something he wasn't ready to name yet. It started with a schedule change. That was what Jonathan called it. He sat across from Victoria at breakfast the following Monday and told her, calmly, that her afternoons would now include an additional tutoring session and a structured study period. No gaps, no free time in the garden. Victoria looked at him. "Starting when?" she said. "Today," he said. Then he picked up his coffee and opened his newspaper, and that was the end of the conversation. She went to school. She came home. She sat through the extra tutoring session without saying a word. At 4:30, the exact time she would normally be walking across the lawn, she sat at her desk and stared at her textbook and thought about Thomas waiting at the fence. He waited the first day. She knew he would. She thought about him waiting the second day, too. Arriving the same way he always did, quiet, careful, checking over his shoulder. Finding the garden empty. Sitting with his notebook anyway, maybe. Or leaving. She didn't know which was worse. On the third day, she went to find her father. He was in his office, the door half open, reading through a contract. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "I need to talk to you," Victoria said. Something in her voice made him set the papers down. She told him everything. Not in pieces, not carefully, all of it. From the first afternoon in the garden to the notebooks they had filled to the way Thomas explained problems by thinking out loud. She told him about the failing grade she had hidden. She told him how fast Thomas was, how certain, how patient even when she got things wrong 3 times in a row. Jonathan listened, without interrupting. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then she said it, not loudly, not with anger, just clearly the way she stated facts. "He's smarter than anyone at my school, Dad, and you would have walked right past him." Something crossed Jonathan's face. It was there for only a moment, then it was gone. "That's enough, Victoria," he said. His voice was flat and final. "Go finish your homework." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and left. Jonathan sat without moving after she was gone. The contract on his desk was still open. On the wall above it hung his degrees, 2 universities, both framed in dark wood. Beside them, the award from his first major company, the photograph from the magazine profile, the things he had put there to remind himself of how far he had come. He looked at them the way he always did. Then something shifted, slightly, like a picture hanging 1 degree off level that you suddenly can't stop noticing. He reached for his phone. He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he made a call. Jonathan Hayes was not a man who asked other people to find things for him. He made the calls himself, quietly over 2 days between meetings, a contact at the city's social services office, a former colleague who worked in child welfare law, a woman he knew who ran a nonprofit that tracked unaccompanied minors in the county system. He gave them one thing, the boy's first name and a description. By the second evening, he had a file. Thomas Carter, 10 years old, no living parents, father unknown, mother deceased 3 years ago, an accident. For 2 years after that, he had lived with his maternal grandmother, Billionaire Carter, in a rented apartment on the east side of the city. Billionaire Carter had died 8 months ago, cardiac arrest, no other family on record. Jonathan read that line twice. After Billionaire died, the apartment was lost. Thomas had been flagged briefly in the system, a welfare check was filed, a case number was assigned. Then, 6 weeks later, the case was marked inactive. The reason given was a single typed line, child not located at last known address. Nobody had looked again. He had simply fallen out of the file, out of the system, out of sight. Jonathan set that page aside and picked up the next one. His contact had found something else. 3 letters, printed copies of emails, sent from a public library computer over the past 4 months. Thomas had written to 3 separate school scholarship programs. The letters were short and careful. He introduced himself, explained his situation plainly, listed the subjects he had been studying on his own, and asked if there was any way to be considered despite not having a permanent address. All 3 programs had replied. Form letters, the same language in each one, more or less. Thank you for reaching out. Unfortunately, applicants must provide proof of residential address to be eligible. One of them had added a single extra sentence. We wish you the best in your educational journey. Nobody had looked at his work. Nobody had asked what he actually knew. Jonathan sat back in his chair. Outside his office window, the estate grounds were dark. The garden where Thomas had spent 47 minutes teaching his daughter was just a shadow now, empty and still. He thought about the form letters, 3 of them. A 10-year-old boy, alone in a library, writing carefully worded emails to people who had already decided he didn't qualify before they'd read a single word. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not pity. Fury. Not at Thomas. Never at Thomas. At a system that had taken one look at the boy's address, or the absence of one, and closed every door before he had a chance to knock. Jonathan picked up his pen. This time, he didn't reach for his phone. He started writing a list. Jonathan left the house at 5:40 in the morning. No jacket, no coffee. He walked the 2 blocks in the gray early light with his hands in his pockets and his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. He had found the bench the day before part of the investigation, a detail from his contact who had quietly tracked Thomas's routine over the past week. The boy was already there. He was sitting at the far end of the bench with his backpack wedged between his feet and a thick textbook open across his knees. His lips moved slightly as he read, the way they do when a problem demands full concentration. He didn't hear Jonathan approach. Jonathan sat down at the other end of the bench. Thomas went completely still. He didn't run. But every part of him pulled inward, shoulders tightening, chin dropping, the careful blankness settling across his face that Jonathan now recognized. The expression that meant, I know what comes next. I've been here before. Jonathan looked straight ahead. Neither of them spoke. A minute passed, maybe more. Somewhere behind them, a car started. A dog barked once and went quiet. The sky was turning from gray to pale gold at the edges, and the city was still mostly asleep, and it was just the 2 of them on a bench in the cold early morning, and Jonathan let the silence sit there until it stopped feeling like a threat. Then he said it. What do you want? Not, what do you need? Not, what can I do for you? Not the careful language of charity or the brisk tone of someone managing a situation. What do you want? Thomas turned his head slowly and looked at Jonathan directly for the first time. Not a glance, not a quick check. He actually looked at him the way he looked at problems, steady, measuring, deciding whether the question was real. Jonathan held his gaze and waited. I want to take a test, Thomas said. Jonathan didn't respond. He let the answer stay in the air between them. A real one, Thomas said. Not a practice sheet, not something I found in a trash bin. A real test with real scoring that tells me exactly where I am. He paused. I just want to know what I actually know, that's all. Not a home, not money, not safety or warmth or any of the things he needed badly enough that any reasonable person would have asked for them first. Just a test. Just the chance to find out if the years of quiet, stubborn, solitary learning had added up to something real. Jonathan looked at the textbook still open on Thomas's knees. 9th grade algebra, dog-eared, covered in pencil notes in the margins. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, okay. Just that, one word. But the way he said it left no room for doubt. Jonathan made the first call that same morning. He didn't go home first. He sat on the bench after Thomas left, pulled out his phone, and dialed the headmaster of Whitmore Academy, the school Victoria had attended since she was 5 years old. The second call went to his attorney. The third to a child welfare advocate he had been connected to 3 days earlier and hadn't yet spoken to. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't tell Victoria. He didn't post anything or speak to anyone who might turn it into a story about him. He just made the calls, answered the questions, signed what needed to be signed, and moved through the process the same way he moved through everything, quietly, completely, without stopping. It took 30 days. On the 31st day, Thomas Carter had a legal guardian, an enrollment letter, and a school uniform that had been fitted to him by a tailor who asked no questions. He stood in the hallway outside his new classroom for a long moment before going in. The noise on the other side of the door was ordinary. Chairs scraping, voices overlapping, the particular sound of a room full of children who had grown up never once wondering whether they belonged there. Thomas had spent 4 months wondering about almost nothing else. He pushed the door open and walked in. Victoria didn't look up from her notebook when he entered. She was midway through something, her pencil moving quickly, her focus total. But as the room shifted and several heads turned toward the new student near the door, she reached out without looking and pulled the empty chair beside her slightly away from the desk, making space, as if she had always known he would need it. Thomas sat down. He set his backpack on the floor and his notebook on the desk, and he looked at the front of the classroom where the teacher was already beginning to write the morning's first problem on the board. He picked up his pencil. He already knew the answer. Jonathan stood in the hallway outside the classroom window. He had followed at a distance, staying back far enough that neither child could see him. He watched Thomas walk in. He watched Victoria move the chair. He watched the two of them settle side by side, her blazer pressed and spotless, his slightly stiff in the newness of it, and turn their attention to the same problem on the same board. He stayed until he was sure. Then he walked back down the hallway alone. On the row of lockers outside the classroom, Thomas's old backpack hung on the hook beside Victoria's pristine school bag. The worn canvas and the polished leather, side by side in the same small square of space. 2 different worlds, same hook, same hallway. The same chance, finally at the same future. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.